Hello, this is Markability with The Art of Diesel. As you know, a few weeks ago I brought home a 17-year-old Turbodiesel that I bought in Florida, brought it back to Ohio, and this vehicle is kind of special. It's a 2005 E320 CDI. This is one of only 2 years where we could get an OM648 inline 6 in the United States, which is arguably the best Mercedes-Benz diesel engine ever built. Now, I've had some time off over the holidays, but I spent a lot of time doing research and buying parts. A lot of those parts are cosmetic just because the vehicle got baked in the sun. It spent most all of its life in the Florida sun. I don't think it was ever garaged. We've also had some unexpected events with extended family during my time off, so progress hasn't been what I wanted. But let me start by talking about my goals. So what I really want to do with this vehicle is I want to have a mild setup using a hybrid turbo, an improved intercooler, and clean up the intake manifold, including deleting EGR, swirl flaps, silencer, and then literally cleaning it, because with 179,000 miles on it, the intake manifold is almost undoubtedly plugged with gunk, which is something that EGR does to diesels. It's bad. The other thing that I will do is I'll clean up the exhaust, and that will mean addressing the catalyst and the overly restrictive mufflers. Additionally, I will install tunes for the engine and transmission, which will allow the vehicle to make the best use of the modifications. And eventually I'll put a limited slip in, because the car has an open differential in the rear right now, and I expect the engine to produce in excess of 500 pound-feet of torque. Now, I'll share more detail on this setup as I work my way along through the effort. The first steps are to take care of the basics, ensure the foundation's in place, and then move forward. In today's video, you've already seen me torque checking the engine mounts, and this is done by simply putting the vehicle in drive, holding the brake, and pushing on the accelerator to see if the torque moves the engine around excessively. It looks like it's okay. I am actually going to be replacing a transmission mount because there are some vibrations I've noticed. And in today's video, let's take a look at the exhaust and the rear differential to understand what we've got here. Let's also do an oil change and replace thermostat. I've also taken some video related to changing the transmission fluid, but I've learned more since I got started on that, and I'm going to come back and cover that in more detail in a separate video. Okay, let's get started.
By the way, one of the things I've noticed with this car that is worth pointing out right away, this has actually a pretty decent exhaust system on it without any modifications, just because it's got dual exhausts all the way from a Y pipe way up there, and I think this should flow plenty good, except I think these mufflers could be improved on. And what I probably will do is I'll probably cut these out and put in like an angled pipe here and drop like a turbo muffler in here, like a straight through or one with an offset. And I like the downturned pipes. It's understated. If this is going to be a sleeper, I don't want to be advertising too much what I've got going on under the hood. Anyhow, so let's take a look at this. From what I understand, it should be written on the case what the gear ratio is. What I believe, from what I've read, this will be the 210 millimeter ring gear setup, probably with a 2.47 gear ratio, given which car it's in. You know, for the diesel, you're trying to maximize fuel economy, which means minimizing engine RPM. A lower numeric ratio in the rear end means that this doesn't turn as many times for every time this turns. This will turn 2.47 times for every time that the rear axle turns. So when you see more normal ratios on cars, you'll see them in the 3s, and you'll see dragsters, it'll be like 410 gears and things like that. But on something like this where we're going for efficiency, 2.47 is a good gear ratio, keeps those RPMs down in the lower 2000s at highway speeds, which is very important if you want to keep good fuel economy. Maybe hurts acceleration some, but with all the torque this engine has, I don't think that the low end is an issue at all. How's this looking? It looks a little crusty, but I don't see it. It doesn't appear to be all cracked or anything. Sometimes these are. Oh, here's something over here. This is an A2303510105, and it's GGG-40. So I'll have to look that up. That might be it right here. It's a little different. Rather than the 2.47, this is the 2.65 gear ratio.
Next, we move on to the oil change, and naturally, of course, I put a pan under there and remove the plug. Next, I found out that the TDI ratchet adapter that I had for the oil filter housing from a VW TDI actually fit just fine on the Mercedes. It is different from the one that I use on the OM642 engines. I didn't realize that, but okay, I'm lucky, so this works. If all else fails, I could have used a strap wrench, but anyhow. So here I loosen it and I give it a moment to let the oil drip off it. I've got a container handy. When I'm ready, I get that thing moved into the container quickly in order to avoid just getting oil everywhere, and let it drain in that container. Then I wipe out the sealing edge of the filter housing. Next, I'm just checking to make sure that these are the same, and I realize that this filter setup has 3 O-rings, so I go about removing all 3 of them. As I go to install them, first I wipe everything down again. Just make sure that things are reasonably clean. I want to make sure I don't have a bunch of boogers in the threads when I go to put this filter back together. I take a little bit of fresh oil and I lube up the O-rings a little bit, each one, before I install them. The big O-ring takes the most work to get it in place, but you could just work it slowly with your fingers. It is nice that I'm using a K&N one here, so the O-ring is bright orange and stands out. Makes for a good visual here, but the bottom line is you can see there is a specific groove it needs to go into. Make sure it gets into that groove. Here's the second ring. I loop that up. That one goes into place very quickly and easily. As I move on to the third O-ring, I realized that I had so much oil on my fingertips already that basically picking it up and moving around between my fingers, I had it lubed. So now I can go ahead and put the filter in. I look at both ends and realize there's no such thing as up or down on these. They're symmetric. And so then I'm able to reinstall this. Go ahead and get my ratchet and tighten it down. Don't over tighten it. You just want to bottom it out. Add just a little bit of torque at the bottom. Yeah, it looks like I'm using a big wrench, but I'm mostly just trying to get a feel for what I'm doing. I'm not hitting it hard. Okay, here we have me annealing the copper washer. I didn't have a spare. You can see how it changes colors. That's part of how you know you've actually annealed it. So next I'm ready to put the oil plug back in using that annealed copper washer. The annealing process makes it nice and soft so that it seals well. It would be better to use a new one, but annealing it is a good second best. Got to put a wrench on it, tighten it, don't over tighten it. Next I can put the oil in, and here I'm showing it at high speed, but it does take a long time to put oil into this engine because there's a restriction at the oil filler tube. Now you put a fair amount of oil in, and because there's no dipstick, you actually have to use the display in the car to check the oil level. And you start by going into the menu, going to the page that shows the temperature, and working your way in from there. So when you're in there, you'll find this engine oil level. You have to do it with the engine off, of course, but with the ignition on. And here it said add 2 liters, and it can only measure 2 liters low. So if you're more than 2 liters low, it'll still say 2 liters. So here you see it twice, even after I put some oil in. So I keep putting oil in and coming back. On this next go around, when I checked it, I started getting to a point where it could measure, and now it said 1.5 liters needed to be added. So this time I use a measuring cup because I need to be a little bit more careful with my measurement. Put in about what it's asking for, check again, and it comes back and says it's okay. So I can now put the oil cap on. The oil change is complete. Next, I'm going to work on the thermostat. In order to remove that, it's built into a housing. The first step is to remove the hoses at the front. So the radiator hose, once I've loosened the clamps on both, the radiator hose comes off fairly easily if I grab it with channel locks and rotate it. It's a trick to bust hoses loose. Rotate them, then you can pull them off with your fingers. Of course, have something beneath ready to capture the coolant that will drain onto the ground. Then I did the same thing with the overflow hose. After that point, I'm ready to loosen up the 3 bolts that connect the thermostat housing to the engine's head. That top middle one is very difficult to get to. And the front lower one is even tougher, until you realize that the best thing to do is simply to remove the oil filter. So I removed the oil filter. It would have been smart to put a rag in there right away, keep stuff from falling in, but it does allow you to get a straight shot at those bolts. Then I used my electric driver to pull the bolts and set them aside. I did drop one of them. Thankfully, it didn't go down the oil filter housing. I was able to retrieve it there with a magnet. Then I realized the housing wasn't loose. There's a 4th bolt that goes forward through this bracket you see on the front. So here I am removing that bolt. With that bolt out of the way, there's still one more thing that needs to be done before it can actually be removed, which is disconnect the connection for the temperature sensor. There's a temperature sensor built into the housing. There's a plug right here. The plastic was brittle. You should normally be able to just squeeze the rear side of it and pull, but because the plastic is old and brittle, I had to pry up on the part to get it loose, and in the process wound up busting some plastic. At that point I was able to pry the housing loose with a screwdriver. Yeah, be careful what you pry on, but anyhow, that's how I did it. You pull back the fuel hoses and you can pull that thing out of there. At that point I take a rag and I just do some cleanup. Just trying to make sure the surfaces are nice and clean so that the gasket will have a chance to seal. I go ahead and pull back the fuel hoses again and start installing the new thermostat housing. When it comes to putting in the first bolt, the easiest one to put in is this one at the lower rear, because you can see it. You can make sure it's properly aligned. You can put your hand right on everything, so it's a good choice. At that point, you can go ahead. It's easier to line up the other 2 holes at that point, so you can go ahead and put in the others, and I'll just speed up the film for that. So I go ahead and get those started. Then I get out my driver and put them in. I'm just putting them in to the point where I'm running down the lengths of the threads, and what I'm not doing is using that to torque them. I'm just going to go until I get that first click. As soon as there's any little bit of resistance, I go ahead and stop, and then I tighten by hand using a ratchet. I'm sure we could find the torque specs. I just did what felt right. That's what I usually do. I've been doing this long enough to have a good feel for those things. If you have any doubt, look at the manual, find the right torque spec. But anyhow, you don't want to overdo it. You are torquing into an aluminum head. Here I am just doing the last bit of tightening. I also realized I could not get the front bolt that goes through the bracket started because it didn't align with the bracket perfectly. So I loosened up all the other bolts that hold that bracket so I could shift the bracket around. Once I did that, I was able to get the bolt started in the front. And then at that point I could tighten down that bolt as well as all the other bolts in that bracket. The next thing that had to be done was to put a support in that little bracket that holds the fuel hoses that are on the right here. And what I found was that hole that goes between the fuel hoses there is actually not threaded. It's a problem that I chose to grab a discount version of the housing. They did not actually thread the hole, so here I am trying to put it in, and I can't get that thing started. So I crane my head around and take a look at the hole, and oh well, son of a gun, that sucker is not threaded. So I go ahead and get up my tap kit and tap the hole. Another good reason to make sure you've got a rag over that oil filter hole. You don't want shavings going down inside the engine. So I went ahead and tapped the thing, and then I was able to install that bracket. At that point I could install the hoses, and I could also go ahead and put coolant back in the engine and start it up and look for leaks. So I did all of that. That kind of summarizes what I was able to accomplish recently, and as I pick things back up, you'll see more from me in the near future. I'll start by showing you what I did with the transmission fluid. So that'll be my next video. So that wraps up what we were able to do recently. So be sure to come back again. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, get involved in the discussion on whatever platform you're watching this on. And make sure you come check us out at our Substack, which is going to be the primary source where we're going to publish our information, which is artofdiesel.substack.com. Thank you.